Just one stormy night, everything changed in the luxurious mansion. The body of a powerful man lay silently under the dim light, a dark secret hidden within the wealthy walls. Could the painful betrayal of the wife and a forbidden love with a homeless man be the key to uncovering the truth? Or is there something even more dreadful waiting behind the closed doors? The wealthy and powerful life of the old woman and her husband. The mansion stood amidst a vast estate, surrounded by high walls and meticulously trimmed gardens. It had been the residence of this wealthy couple for decades. The mansion was not just a symbol of their wealth but also reflected their power in high society. Every detail, from the sparkling crystal chandeliers to the famous paintings on the walls, exuded luxury. This was a world accessible only to the privileged few. John Sterling, the husband, was a seasoned businessman with a powerful network of connections ranging from politics to finance. He was known as a cold and decisive man. His business partners were well aware that when they entered a meeting with him, they were facing a man who never conceded. But in his own home, John wore a completely different face. He was no longer the man Evelyn Sterling had once loved decades ago. The sweet words and thoughtful care had gradually been replaced by silence and distance. Evelyn, a graceful woman whose beauty had once turned heads, now bore the weight of loneliness and disappointment. In her 60s, she still maintained an attractive appearance, but inside, she felt empty. Each day in her life of luxury was now filled only with social events, leisurely strolls around the opulent gardens, and the cold distance from her husband. Evelyn had once taken pride in her marriage, but now she realized that love had long since died, leaving her imprisoned in the very luxurious life she had once desired. Their life was like a perfect but hollow painting. The grand mansion was a place where Evelyn felt lost, despite having everything a woman could dream of, from sparkling diamonds to the most fashionable clothes from Paris. Yet, all these material things couldn't fill the emptiness in her soul. She felt like an actress in a play, performing the role of a happy wife, but inside, she was barren. The homeless man and the illicit affair. The encounter between Evelyn and Marcus, a young homeless black man, was the beginning of everything that would follow. Marcus, a young man with bright and determined eyes, lived in a nearby shelter. He wandered the streets leading to the mansion, where he often looked for odd jobs or simply some food. The hardships of life had made Marcus strong, but they also filled him with resentment toward the wealthy society that had cast him aside. Marcus had once had a promising future, but fate had pushed him into the abyss. He had been a university student with dreams for the future, but a series of unfortunate events had taken everything away. Losing his job, with no family to support him, he quickly became homeless, relying on the mercy of others. The weariness and hardship were always evident on Marcus' face, but inside him burned a fire of hatred for the unjust society. One afternoon, Evelyn accidentally met Marcus while walking around the area. With just a fleeting glance, she was captivated by the strength and mystery of this young man. It seemed as though the heavens had gifted Marcus a masculine appearance and an unusual confidence, despite his circumstances being in stark contrast to Evelyn's elegance. Initially, it was just casual conversation. The old lady started bringing food and old clothes for Marcus, telling herself it was an act of charity, an expression of compassion. But soon, the encounters began to take on a different tone. Evelyn, who always felt lonely in the cold mansion, found herself drawn into Marcus' life. He was not just a man in need of help, but also the embodiment of everything she craved: vitality, freedom, and danger. Marcus also recognized this and began to exploit Evelyn's vulnerability. Their early meetings took place outdoors, under the dim afternoon sun. Marcus and Evelyn talked about their lives, about the dreams that had faded. Then, their conversations became touches, lingering glances, and eventually an illicit affair filled with passion. They secretly met in dark corners, reveling in the guilt and danger, ignoring the social rules that bound them. Marcus, who had been cast aside by society, realized that this wealthy old woman could be the key to escaping his harsh life. He began to dream of another life, one where he could enter the world of wealth and power. She knew this relationship was wrong, but the thrill it brought was too powerful to resist. Discovery and revenge. The husband discovers the truth. John Sterling, a powerful and cold-hearted man, was not the type to easily overlook betrayal, especially when that betrayal came from his own wife, Evelyn Sterling. Although their marriage had grown stale over the years, Evelyn had always been a symbol of perfection and grace. However, when John began noticing unusual signs in his wife's behavior, unexpected outings, hurried phone calls cut short when he entered the room, he could not simply let things slide without taking action. Instead of confronting his wife, John chose silence. He was not the type of man to act out of anger. Instead, he hired Paul Larson, a veteran private investigator, to follow his wife. Larson was no stranger to cases of wives having affairs, but this time was different. He knew he was working for John Sterling, a ruthless man who would not tolerate being deceived. Paul Larson began tracking Evelyn's every move. In the first few days, everything seemed normal. Evelyn attended social events, met with friends, and returned home on time. But one night, Larson noticed a change. Evelyn left the house around 9 o'clock in the evening, dressed seductively in a black evening gown adorned with elegant accessories, far too formal for a casual outing. A feeling of unease crept over him as he decided to follow her closely. Evelyn stepped out of the mansion, got into her expensive car, and drove into the dark night. Paul followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. The car glided through the upscale streets of the wealthy neighborhood before suddenly stopping in a desolate area, surrounded by abandoned buildings and rarely frequented. Darkness enveloped the road, with only a few dim lights shining from afar. Evelyn stepped out of the car, the clicking of her high heels barely audible on the ground. Larson stayed in his car, carefully pulling out a camera with a telephoto lens, documenting every moment. He watched as Evelyn slipped into the darkness, approaching an abandoned house, waiting. Shortly after, from the shadows, a man appeared, Marcus, the wild-looking, homeless black man. Larson couldn't believe his eyes. The couple didn't just meet, they immediately embraced with passionate kisses. Marcus clung tightly to Evelyn, his dark hands wrapping around her slim body. Larson didn't miss a single shot, capturing each frame, from their first touch to the point where things went beyond all boundaries. Evelyn was no longer the icy, regal woman she appeared to be, she had transformed into someone entirely different, a person swept away in a vortex of lust and guilt. When everything was clear, Paul Larson snapped the last few photos. He quietly left the scene, knowing he had irrefutable evidence of Evelyn's betrayal in his hands. The next morning, Larson met with John Sterling in his office. With a face devoid of emotion, Paul handed John the envelope containing the photos and video. John opened the envelope, and each picture appeared before him, every image like a dagger to his heart. Evelyn, the woman he once trusted, had betrayed him with someone he regarded as the scum of society. Yet, John showed no emotion. He simply stared at the photos, then quietly nodded. "All right," he said, his voice calm but filled with a dangerous edge. "I'll handle this." Violence and the husband's revenge. John Sterling had no reason to rush. He had all the time and money in the world to plan the perfect revenge. Deep down, John understood that the only way to truly punish Marcus was to make him feel the deepest pain, not just physical, but mental as well. A quick death would be too easy. John wanted Marcus to live in shame and agony for the rest of his life. He reached out to some of the men who had worked for him in the underworld, those unafraid of violence. Tony, the Bull, the leader of this group, took orders from John without question. He knew this mission wasn't just about threatening or scaring Marcus, it was about making him feel the wrath of the rich and powerful, a punishment from which he could never escape. On a rainy night, as Marcus was returning from a meeting with Evelyn, 3 strangers blocked his path. Before Marcus could react, a punch as hard as a hammer smashed into his jaw, sending him sprawling onto the cold ground. The beating continued with brutal punches and kicks, without mercy. Each blow carried the limitless rage of John Sterling. Blood poured from Marcus's mouth and nose, but he still struggled to stand, knowing deep down that he had no chance to fight back. One of the attackers grabbed Marcus by the collar, pulling him up and growling, "You are never to go near her again. This is your last warning." Marcus, his body covered in wounds, collapsed after the final blow. The attackers left him there in the darkness, bloodied and bruised. But amid the pain, Marcus didn't feel fear, he felt anger. His fury toward John Sterling surged within him. Marcus knew that if he fought John with physical strength, he would never win. But if he used cunning and ruthlessness, he might turn the tables. Marcus went to Evelyn, his wounds still fresh. When she opened the door and saw her lover in such a miserable state, she couldn't hide her fear. However, Marcus had not come to seek pity. He convinced Evelyn that the only way the two of them could escape this hell was to kill John. This was not only about revenge for the brutal beating he had endured but also a way to seize the entire Sterling fortune. At first, Evelyn was horrified by the idea, but Marcus, with smooth words and fiery eyes, turned her fear into a vague desire. A cruel plan began to form in their minds, a plan that, if successful, would bring not just freedom but unimaginable wealth. A cruel plan is formed. The boy and the old woman conspire. After the brutal beating, Marcus was no longer the weaker party. The bruises and injuries on his body only deepened his hatred for John Sterling. Each time he touched his wounds, he felt the sting of humiliation and injustice, and from that, a brutal idea began to form: kill John and take it all. When Marcus met Evelyn, she didn't just see a beaten man, but also the burning rage in his eyes. Evelyn had initially been drawn into a passionate affair with Marcus, but now she was facing a much bigger decision: either continue being the victim of her ruthless and powerful husband, or collaborate with her lover to escape this life of imprisonment. In the dead of night, when the mansion was asleep, Marcus and Evelyn met again, this time not in the throes of passion, but in a tense atmosphere. They sat across from each other in a small room, candlelight flickering on Evelyn's anxious face. Marcus, still in pain from the beating, didn't waste time with small talk and got straight to the point. "We can't live like this anymore. If you want to escape him, there's only one way," Marcus said, his voice filled with resolve. Evelyn, her eyes wide with horror, responded in a trembling voice, "What do you mean, Marcus? He's my husband. He's not just your husband, he's the one who ordered them to beat me. He'll never leave us alone. If we don't act first, he'll destroy both of us," Marcus continued, his eyes blazing. "We have to kill him." Marcus's words cut through Evelyn's mind like a sharp blade. The thought of killing her husband made her shudder. She had never imagined she would reach this point, but Marcus's words weren't without reason. She knew John wasn't one to easily forgive, and he had the power to crush them both. Slowly, her fear was overtaken by a desire for freedom. She had lived under John's shadow for too long, trapped in a cold marriage, and now Marcus was her only chance to escape this hell. Evelyn was silent for a long time before finally whispering with a deep sigh, "Are you sure this won't fail?" Marcus nodded, his eyes glowing with determination. "You don't need to worry. I have a plan. As long as you stand by me, we'll get away from all of this. The murder plan is laid out in detail." Marcus knew that killing John couldn't be done recklessly. John was a powerful man, surrounded by a protective network and the cautious nature of a seasoned businessman. A blatant murder would not only lead to failure but could also result in both of them being sentenced to death. Marcus needed a flawless plan, and he was ready to execute it. The plan began with creating the perfect fake crime scene. Marcus proposed that the murder must look like a sudden break-in. "If John is killed by an intruder, no one will suspect us. They'll think it was just an unfortunate robbery," Marcus explained. Evelyn, although still worried, began to see the vision Marcus was painting. The plan continued to evolve. Marcus would sneak into the mansion at night while John was sound asleep. He would use a heavy metal bar to end John's life in an instant, giving him no time to react. After the murder, Marcus would clean up the scene, stage a fake robbery, and steal some valuable items to make it look like a real break-in. The most important part was leaving no trace that could link Evelyn or Marcus to the crime. Marcus also carefully considered the timing. The murder had to happen on a night when John had an important meeting the next morning. This would ensure that if anyone discovered John's death, they would assume the killer had planned it carefully, knowing his schedule in advance. Evelyn's role would be to act as the grieving widow, completely unaware of the murder. She would play the part of the shocked, devastated wife who discovered her husband had been killed. Her tears, her worry, and her inherent fragility would be the perfect cover for any suspicion. Executing the murder. The fateful night. The night John Sterling was meant to die was unlike any other. Heavy rain poured down, the cold drops pounding against the windows as if forewarning something terrible about to happen. Inside the grand mansion, the air was thick with tension. Darkness engulfed every corner, with only the faintest light from night lamps remaining. Evelyn Sterling lay in bed, but her mind was far from calm. Her body trembled under the covers, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, where every ticking second of the clock felt like a hammer striking her heart. With each passing moment, Evelyn felt the weight of the responsibility growing heavier on her frail shoulders. She knew what was about to happen could not be undone. There was no turning back. She had agreed to the plan, but now, as the moment drew near, a part of her wanted to escape from it. Yet the suffocating atmosphere of the room, the years of feeling imprisoned in her cold marriage, and the pain she had endured under John's shadow, prevented her from retreating. Marcus was her last hope, her way out, no matter how dangerous it was. The room was silent, save for John's steady breathing, like a gentle wave rolling across a calm sea before the storm. John had no idea this would be his last night alive. He had grown too confident in his power, in his absolute control over everything around him, that he failed to see that his wife and her lover had quietly plotted to end his life. Outside, Marcus stood still in the rain, his hand gripping the cold metal bar tightly. The rain fell like sharp blades cutting into his skin, but he didn't feel cold. Inside him was only the burning fire of anger, boiling from the humiliation and beating John had inflicted on him. This was Marcus's one chance for revenge, to break free from the injustice that had weighed down his life. Marcus crouched down, slipping through the window he had prepared earlier. Rainwater followed him inside, but he left no trace behind. His leather gloves ensured no fingerprints were left, and each of his steps was as quiet as a shadow in the night. The mansion was large, but he knew every corner by heart, thanks to Evelyn's prior guidance. The dim light from the hallway was enough for him to move without needing a flashlight. He took each step slowly, his eyes and ears alert to every sound, but the house remained eerily quiet. As Marcus neared the bedroom, his heart began to beat faster. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and now, it was only seconds away. Marcus opened the bedroom door so gently that no sound escaped. In the dim light, he saw John sound asleep, unaware of the fate that awaited him. John lay on his back, his face peaceful and his eyes closed, completely unaware that this would be his final sleep. Evelyn lay next to John, her body tense, gripping the edge of the blanket as if trying to suppress the flood of emotions inside her. Marcus wasted no time. He stepped closer, standing right beside the bed, raising the metal bar high. In that brief moment, he stared at John's face, the powerful man who had once beaten and humiliated him. This was the moment of revenge, the moment he had been waiting for. With all his strength, Marcus brought the metal bar down on John's head. A dry thud echoed through the room, and blood began to spurt from the victim's head, staining the pristine white sheets. John had no chance to react. The first blow left him dazed, but Marcus didn't stop. He struck again, and again, each blow harder and more brutal than the last. The sound of skull cracking filled the room, and blood poured out more and more, turning the bed crimson. Evelyn, lying right beside him, felt every blow, every thud reverberating in the small space of the room. She didn't dare turn her head, only clutching the blanket, her whole body shaking. Each swing of the bar was like a knife stabbing into her mind, and each drop of blood splattered was a part of her memory being crushed. She had agreed to this plan, but as she witnessed her husband being murdered right before her eyes, all the emotions surged forward: fear, guilt, and a hint of regret. After the final blow, Marcus stood still, breathing heavily. In front of him, John Sterling was now nothing more than a lifeless body. Blood pooled on the floor, and John's body was completely motionless. Marcus bent down, using his gloved hand to wipe John's face, as if to check if he was still alive. When he realized that John was dead, a faint smile flickered across his face. But the job wasn't finished yet. Staging the scene and the evidence, Marcus quickly moved on to the next part of the plan. He carefully staged the crime scene, making the murder look like a botched break-in. According to the plan, he snuck out of the bedroom, broke a nearby window pane to create the sound of a break-in, and ransacked a few drawers, taking valuable items such as watches, wallets, and jewelry. Everything was placed into a small bag he had prepared earlier, giving the police a reason to believe the intruder had stolen valuables before fleeing. Every movement Marcus made was swift and precise. He had practiced this moment beforehand, leaving no trace behind. The leather gloves helped him avoid leaving fingerprints, and every step was carefully calculated. "It's all done," he whispered, his voice cold. "We did it." Evelyn slowly sat up, staring at her husband's lifeless body. Blood still soaked the sheets, and she couldn't stop the shiver that ran down her spine. The plan had succeeded, but now, faced with the reality of what they had done, she realized the horror of her actions. There was no turning back anymore. John was dead, and Evelyn had now become an accomplice to murder. The freedom she had longed for had finally arrived, but at a price far too high. Marcus and Evelyn's plan had unfolded as they had envisioned. The house appeared to have been broken into, valuables stolen, and John Sterling murdered in a chaotic struggle. When the police arrived, the staged scene did exactly what Marcus had intended: it threw off suspicion. To all appearances, it was a simple case of burglary gone horribly wrong. Evelyn, playing the role of the devastated widow, was perfect in her performance. Her trembling hands, tear-streaked face, and soft sobs painted the picture of a woman who had lost her husband to a random act of violence. The officers, seasoned in their duties, had no reason to suspect her. After all, John had been a wealthy man with enemies. A random break-in fit the narrative. However, as the investigation wore on, cracks began to form in their perfect story. Detectives noticed inconsistencies in the break-in scene, small details that Marcus had overlooked in his haste. And while Evelyn's emotional display had been convincing, something about her seemed off, too rehearsed, too perfect in her grief. The case soon took a dramatic turn when one of John Sterling's loyal associates came forward with crucial information. This associate had always been suspicious of Evelyn's relationship with Marcus, having seen them together on more than one occasion. He provided the police with leads they couldn't ignore, which ultimately shifted the focus of the investigation. What began as a perfect plan to escape John Sterling's oppressive grip quickly unraveled. Marcus and Evelyn, once united by their shared goal of freedom, found themselves trapped by the very lies they had built their future upon. Detectives honed in on their secret affair, questioning Evelyn about her connection to Marcus. Under pressure, her once solid facade began to crack. And Marcus, the man who had masterminded the plot, soon found himself hunted, not by the police alone, but by the very forces of power and influence John Sterling had left behind. The investigation and surprises. The police investigation. The morning after John Sterling was murdered, the luxurious Sterling mansion became the focal point of a shocking murder case. When the maid discovered John's lifeless body on the bed, she screamed in panic, drawing the attention of the entire neighborhood. Her cry echoed through the quiet surroundings, prompting the swift arrival of local police. Within hours, the crime scene was cordoned off, and investigators began to comb through every small detail. Police Chief David Morales, known for his sharpness and brilliant investigative skills, arrived at the scene immediately. He observed the lavish mansion, now cloaked in an eerie and cold atmosphere. John's body lay on the bed, with fatal wounds to the head. The room was in disarray, with several drawers rummaged through and a window broken. At first glance, it appeared to be a burglary gone wrong that had turned into murder. Evelyn, looking calm yet exhausted, testified that she had slept deeply and knew nothing of the incident until the maid discovered her husband's body. Tears streamed down her face, and her hands trembled as she recounted what had happened. She described John as a strong man who had many enemies in the business world. This detail initially led the police to suspect that John's murder could be linked to personal grudges. However, David Morales wasn't easily fooled by the crime scene's appearance. He had solved many cases throughout his career, and from the beginning, something seemed off. The crime looked too perfect, as if the intruder had been too careful. There were no signs of the usual chaos seen in break-ins, no furniture was smashed, and there were no signs of struggle. The items taken were minimal, just a few pieces of jewelry and cash, while the mansion housed far more valuable treasures. Another detail that caught Morales' attention was the broken window. The glass was found inside the bedroom, rather than outside. This was unusual, indicating that the window had likely been broken from the inside, not the outside. Morales carefully noted everything but kept his suspicions to himself, waiting for more evidence. In the days following, the police conducted a comprehensive investigation. They interviewed the maids, neighbors, and even Marcus, who was not initially suspected. Marcus remained calm and careful with his answers, making the police believe he was merely a homeless man that Sterling's had helped. He cleverly kept his distance from the investigation while silently watching every development. Small clues begin to surface. As the investigation progressed, small details began to emerge, raising doubts about the theory that this was a simple break-in. Detective Morales requested footage from nearby security cameras. While the mansion itself lacked direct surveillance, footage from neighbors' cameras and nearby streets showed no unusual activity or strangers entering the area at the time of the murder. This made Morales think, if no one had broken in from the outside, the killer must have been inside the house from the start. However, there was no solid evidence to accuse Evelyn or anyone else in the house. To strengthen his hypothesis, Morales ordered a thorough search of the entire mansion, hoping to uncover more clues. Then, during a search of Marcus's room, a critical discovery was made, a small bag containing some of John's jewelry, carefully hidden under Marcus's bed. This immediately made him the prime suspect. Marcus denied everything, claiming someone had planted the items to frame him, but his explanation didn't convince the police. However, Morales still had doubts. The case was too complex to simply be a murder for money. He believed there was a larger conspiracy behind John Sterling's death, and Marcus was just one piece of the puzzle. Betrayal. As Morales began to question Evelyn more, she became increasingly nervous. Though she initially maintained the calm demeanor of a grieving wife, under the pressure of the investigation, she started to crack. During lengthy interrogations, Evelyn began to show inconsistencies. Her story about the night of the murder changed, with small details no longer matching her original statements. Marcus, sensing the situation was becoming dangerous, planned one final betrayal. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, they would both be convicted. He approached Morales, offering to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. In a secret meeting, Marcus confessed that Evelyn was the mastermind, that she had lured him into the plan to kill her husband and seize his fortune. He recounted the entire scheme in detail, from Evelyn's preparation of the fake crime scene to her encouragement for him to carry out the murder. After hearing Marcus's confession, Morales decided to shift his focus to Evelyn. The police returned to question her again, and this time, under immense pressure, Evelyn couldn't keep her composure. She began to panic, fearing that Marcus would reveal the whole truth. Eventually, she broke down and admitted her role in her husband's murder. The fall of Evelyn. Once the full truth was exposed, Evelyn Sterling became the central figure in a murder case that shocked the public. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, as the mastermind behind John Sterling's death. The story of a wealthy, powerful woman conspiring with her homeless lover to kill her husband and steal his fortune became front-page news. Every detail of the case was exploited by the media, transforming Evelyn from a woman of high society into a symbol of greed and crime. Evelyn's trial lasted for months, drawing intense public and media attention. In court, Evelyn tried to defend herself, but the evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus's testimony sealed her fate. Her defense attorneys attempted to portray her as a victim, manipulated by Marcus, a weak woman driven to crime out of love and desperation in a cold marriage. But the jury didn't buy the story. The truth about Evelyn's calculated plan to murder her husband for money was too clear. In the final session, the jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. Evelyn was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her face, once proud and powerful, was now empty and lifeless as she listened to the verdict. She sat silently in her seat, staring at the floor, devoid of any vitality. Her entire world had collapsed. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered, waiting for every new update. Reporters jostled for position, eager to capture Evelyn's last moments before she was taken away to prison. They couldn't believe that the woman who had once been one of high society's most prominent figures was now just a shadow, destroyed by her own greed and cruelty. Marcus's betrayal and his price to pay. Marcus, who had betrayed Evelyn in exchange for leniency, didn't escape punishment either. Although his cooperation with the police earned him a lighter sentence, he still faced many years in prison. In court, he also tried to paint himself as a victim, manipulated by Evelyn. Marcus insisted that he hadn't intended to kill John at first but had been convinced and manipulated by Evelyn. Although Marcus's testimony helped solve the case, no one in the court believed he was innocent. He was still seen as a co-conspirator in a brutal murder. In the end, Marcus was sentenced to 20 years in prison for second-degree murder and theft. While his sentence was lighter than Evelyn's, for Marcus, the years in prison were the price he had to pay for his betrayal and greed. During his time in prison, Marcus gradually realized that his betrayal of Evelyn hadn't saved him from his fate. He had not only lost his freedom but also all trust and any opportunity for a fresh start. The years behind bars transformed Marcus from an angry and ambitious man into a shadow of his former self. He was shunned by both inmates and society, and his story became a cautionary tale about the destruction greed can cause. A bitter end. The Sterling murder case quickly became a symbol of greed and crime in the upper echelons of society. The media continued to dissect every detail, from the Sterling family's lavish lifestyle to Evelyn and Marcus's downfall. For the public, it wasn't just a murder case but a stark warning about the dangers of letting greed and desire control one's life. Evelyn spent the rest of her days in prison, stripped of her luxury and power. She lived in isolation, abandoned by everyone. The friends who once praised and admired her now kept their distance, and no one remembered her as the powerful woman she once was. Evelyn had pushed herself into the darkest corner of life, where she faced the punishment for the crimes she had committed. As for Marcus, his years in prison were a constant reminder of his mistakes. Despite his cooperation with the police, he never escaped the guilt and torment. His life, once filled with hopes of change and escaping homelessness, was now nothing but a series of failures and regrets. Community and media reactions. The story of the Sterling murder case captivated the public for a long time. Newspapers, television shows, and documentaries were produced based on the case. People were drawn to the complexity of the case, betrayal, ambition, and the high price to pay. Everyone discussed and debated the deeper causes of the crime and how greed could destroy even the richest and most powerful individuals. The case also sparked significant debate among lawyers and the courts regarding Marcus's role. Many believed he had manipulated Evelyn, while others thought Evelyn had led herself down the path of crime. Either way, both had paid dearly for their actions. Ultimately, the Sterling murder case wasn't just a crime story, it was a lesson in the dangers of allowing greed, desire, and power to dictate one's life. It served as proof that no one can escape the consequences of the evil they commit. A case that shook society. After the trial and sentencing of Evelyn Sterling and Marcus, their story became a hot topic, causing shockwaves across various layers of society. For the public, this was not just a simple murder case, but the collapse of a symbol of wealth and power. The Sterling family had been considered one of the most affluent and successful families in high society, with a glamorous and flawless image. However, behind that luxurious curtain lay betrayal, crime, and boundless greed. Evelyn's story was thoroughly exploited by the media. Articles featured images of her during her glory days, wearing designer outfits, attending lavish parties, contrasted with pictures of her in court, her face gaunt, and her eyes dim. The articles didn't just focus on her crime but also highlighted the downfall of a woman who once had it all: money, fame, and power. Many commented that Evelyn Sterling's case was a clear example of how no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, could escape punishment if they fell into crime. Media coverage and documentaries. Not long after the case concluded, documentary and television producers began planning to capitalize on the story. A series of documentaries aired on major networks, delving into every detail of the case, from Evelyn's secret relationship with Marcus to the murder plot and the complex police investigation. These documentaries didn't just focus on the crime aspect but also explored the psychological dynamics of the key players. Viewers were drawn to the story of a powerful woman, swept into a spiral of lust and crime, alongside a seemingly weak homeless man who knew how to manipulate the situation. Questions about morality, power, and greed were raised, sparking endless public debate about the truth behind the story. Beyond the media, the Sterling family's story also became a source of inspiration for crime novels and films. Some screenwriters even adapted the story into more sensationalized versions, adding fictional elements for extra drama. However, in any form, the case of John Sterling retained its allure, a story of betrayal and ambition. Diverging social opinions. While the public largely condemned Evelyn, there were still differing opinions regarding her sentence. Some believed Evelyn was a victim of a high-pressure marriage, trapped in the cold indifference and power of John Sterling, and that she was merely seeking love and escape. Supporters of this view argued that Evelyn had been pushed to the edge and manipulated by Marcus. They debated that a life sentence was too harsh, and that John was the true cause of everything that went wrong. On the other hand, others argued that regardless of the circumstances, Evelyn had no reason to plot her husband's murder. They believed her choice to handle the situation with violence and conspiracy was unforgivable. Evelyn had allowed greed to control her, and instead of seeking a legal way out of the marriage, she chose the path of crime. Marcus, despite his cooperation with the police, didn't escape public disdain. Many viewed him as the real mastermind, an ambitious homeless man who took advantage of Evelyn's vulnerability to achieve his own goals. Some psychologists even analyzed Marcus publicly, describing him as a manipulative figure, always seeking to exploit circumstances to rise in life, no matter the ethical consequences. Long-lasting impacts. The Sterling case was not just a temporary shock but left far-reaching consequences. The upper-class community, where the Sterling family had been a symbol, now faced questions about trust and asset protection. After the case, many other powerful families implemented stricter security measures, some even hiring private investigators to monitor internal family matters, fearing they too might become victims of similar schemes. The media also realized the power of exploiting crime stories within wealthy families. The Sterling case became a model for many subsequent crime shows, with programs like Mysteries of Powerful Families or Crimes Behind Mansion Walls being produced and aired continuously, attracting large audiences.